A man is rushing to an important meeting when his expensive car suddenly stalls. Just as he's about to give up, a black woman approaches and warns the car is about to explode. Skeptical because of her appearance, he refuses to listen until she proves her warning true. He has no idea the person who saved him is the mystery the entire city is searching for, and what happens next will change his life forever. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The morning had started perfectly for Michael Harrison. His Tesla Roadster SpaceX edition purred through Chicago's financial district like a technological predator, its quantum battery system humming with $3.8 million worth of engineering precision. He was running exactly on schedule for the most important investor meeting of his career, the kind of presentation that would either catapult Nexus Dynamics into the Fortune 500 or relegate him to the graveyard of failed tech entrepreneurs. Then the universe decided to remind him that perfection was an illusion. The car began making a sound that didn't exist in any owner's manual, a high-pitched whine that spoke of expensive things failing in expensive ways. Michael felt his stomach drop as warning lights cascaded across the dashboard like digital dominoes. By the time he managed to pull into an empty parking lot in Chicago's industrial district, his morning was dissolving into a nightmare of smoking electronics and automotive systems that cost more than most people's houses. "Come on, not today," he muttered, stabbing at his phone while the November wind cut through his tailored suit. The Tesla concierge service put him on hold. Again, his investors were expecting him in 2 hours. The presentation that represented 5 years of work, 12-hour days, and every dollar of his inheritance was supposed to begin with him stepping out of this technological marvel, not standing beside it like a well-dressed refugee from automotive catastrophe. Michael had built his reputation on controlling variables, on preparing for every contingency except the ones that actually mattered. The son of a Detroit assembly line supervisor and a Cleveland public school teacher, he'd clawed his way through state universities and startup failures to build something that mattered. This car wasn't just transportation aids, it was proof that a kid from Michigan could play in Silicon Valley's biggest leagues. Now it was just an expensive pile of failing circuits. "Excuse me, sir." The voice came from behind him, careful and professional. Michael turned to see a woman approaching with the measured pace of someone who had learned not to startle people already having bad days. She was probably around 45 with neatly cropped black hair and a healthy brown complexion, and she seemed to be assessing his situation with technical precision rather than curiosity. Her clothes told a story Michael recognized but tried not to think about. Michael's worn jeans that had been good quality once, a faded University of Michigan sweatshirt that had seen too many laundromats, and the kind of careful cleanliness that came from limited resources and unlimited dignity. She carried herself like someone who had once commanded respect and still expected it despite circumstances that suggested otherwise. "The quantum thermal management system is in cascade failure," she said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I can hear the coolant regulators cycling incorrectly, and that particular whine means you've got maybe 25 minutes before the whole battery matrix goes critical." Michael felt his phone slip in his suddenly sweaty grip. This stranger had just diagnosed his car's problem with more precision than the manufacturer's hotline had managed in 30 minutes of hold music. "How could you possibly know that?" he asked, his voice carrying the skepticism of someone whose morning had already exceeded his tolerance for unexpected variables. The woman's expression remained calm, but something shifted behind her eyes. A flicker of old pain perhaps, or just the weary recognition of a familiar conversation. "Because I spent 2 years developing the thermal regulation algorithms that system is based on. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, and until 3 years ago, I was Senior Research Director at General Motors' Advanced Propulsion Division." Michael felt his world tilt slightly. GM Advanced Propulsion. He knew that name from patent filings and industry publications, from the kind of breakthrough research that shaped entire industries. But looking at this woman's circumstances, the worn clothes, the careful way she held herself just outside the sphere of normal social interaction, none of it made sense. 3 years ago, he repeated slowly, his mind struggling to process the contradiction between her claimed expertise and obvious current situation. "Things change," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned to summarize complex tragedy in 2 words. Right now though, your car is about to suffer catastrophic battery failure, and I'm probably the only person within 50 miles who understands the system well enough to prevent it. She gestured toward the smoking vehicle with the clinical detachment of an expert discussing a familiar problem. The question, Mr. Harrison, is whether you're going to let 3 years of circumstances keep you from accepting help from someone who might be the only person who can save your morning. Michael stared at her, caught between desperation and disbelief. The rational part of his mind catalogued everything wrong with this situation. The implausible coincidence, the stranger's unlikely expertise, the risk of trusting someone whose life had clearly gone off the rails. But the entrepreneur in him recognized something else, the calm confidence of genuine knowledge and the particular way she'd pronounced his name, as if she'd seen it in industry publications and knew exactly who he was. His phone buzzed with another text from his lead investor, looking forward to seeing the full presentation. This could be the partnership that changes everything. 24 minutes until his car became a very expensive pile of scrap metal. 2 hours until the meeting that would determine whether 5 years of work meant anything at all. Dr. Whitmore, he said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore had once presented her research on quantum thermodynamics to packed auditoriums at conferences around the world. She'd held patents worth millions, published papers that shaped entire industries, and commanded respect from peers who considered her one of the brightest minds in materials science. That life felt like watching someone else's movie now, flickering memories from before everything fell apart. The Chicago shelter where she'd been staying for 8 months had strict morning hours. Up at 6, out by 8, don't return until 5, unless you had documentation of job interviews or medical appointments. Sarah used the public library as her second home, arriving when it opened and claiming a corner table where she could read discarded technical journals and work on calculations using the backs of scrap paper and borrowed pencils. She'd been walking to the library when she heard the distinct whine of a quantum battery in thermal distress. The sound was unmistakable to someone who had spent 2 years perfecting the algorithms that prevented exactly this kind of cascade failure. 3 blocks out of her way, curiosity and old professional instincts had drawn her toward the source of the problem. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could diagnose cutting-edge automotive technology but couldn't convince a McDonald's manager to give her an interview. The system had its own brutal logic. No permanent address meant no job interviews, no job meant no apartment meant no address. Round and round, a perfect trap that caught the educated and uneducated alike, but seemed especially cruel to those who had once soared high before falling. The General Motors incident had destroyed more than her career. It had shattered her faith in meritocracy itself. The prototype failure hadn't been her fault. The investigation eventually proved that management had overridden her safety recommendations to meet an arbitrary deadline. But by the time the truth emerged, the damage was complete. Her reputation was radioactive, her name associated with a $40 million loss and 3 injuries that could have been prevented if executives had listened to their lead engineer instead of their marketing department. Gender discrimination lawsuits were expensive and time-consuming, and they rarely ended well for the women who filed them. Sarah had learned this lesson watching colleagues who tried to fight back, only to find themselves blacklisted across entire industries. Better to disappear quietly and hope for a fresh start somewhere else. Except there was no somewhere else for a woman in her 40s with an unexplained gap in her employment history and no references willing to take calls. She volunteered at the shelter's after-school program 3 days a week, teaching basic science to kids whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't afford tutors. These 8 and 9-year-olds didn't care about her professional failures or her uncertain housing situation. They just wanted to know why magnets worked and how airplanes stayed in the sky, and Sarah found purpose in their bright curiosity and unlimited questions. Standing beside Michael Harrison's disabled Tesla, watching him process her claim about GM and thermal dynamics, Sarah felt the familiar weight of proving herself to someone who had already decided she wasn't worth listening to. The pattern was always the same. Initial skepticism based on her appearance, grudging attention when she demonstrated knowledge, then the inevitable questions about why someone with her credentials was in her current situation. as if homelessness were a moral failing rather than a systemic trap. But this car was going to explode in less than 30 minutes, and she was probably the only person within 50 miles who understood exactly why and how to prevent it. "Look, I appreciate whatever you're trying to do here," Michael said, taking a half step back and reaching for his phone again. "But this vehicle contains proprietary technology worth more than most people make in a lifetime. I can't just let random people start poking around under the hood." Sarah felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but kept her expression neutral. She'd learned to expect this reaction, though it never stopped hurting. "I understand your concern, but that random person is trying to prevent your proprietary technology from turning into a very expensive pile of melted metal and toxic smoke." "Right." Michael's tone carried the polite skepticism of someone humoring what he clearly considered a delusional person. "And you just happened to be walking by when my car broke down. What are the odds?" "Actually quite high, considering I walk this route to the library every morning and quantum battery failures in extreme weather conditions follow predictable patterns," Sarah replied evenly. "The thermal management system in your vehicle has a known vulnerability in the secondary cooling loop that becomes critical when ambient temperature drops below 40 degrees Fahrenheit while the battery is under high discharge load." Michael's finger paused over his phone screen. The morning temperature was 36 degrees and he'd been running the car's performance mode to impress his investors during their brief ride from the airport. The technical specificity of her explanation was unsettling, but so was everything else about this situation. "Even if you are who you say you are," he said carefully, "which I'm not saying I believe, how do I know you're not some kind of industrial spy? This is exactly the kind of setup corporate espionage operations use." The accusation hit Sarah like cold water. She'd heard variations of this paranoia before, but it still stung to be treated as a potential criminal rather than someone offering help. Her jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Harrison, I recognize you from TechCrunch articles about Nexus Dynamics. You've built a reputation on taking calculated risks and recognizing opportunities others miss." She gestured toward the smoking car. "Right now you have a choice. You can wait 4 hours for authorized technicians who may or may not be able to prevent catastrophic battery failure, or you can let someone with direct experience in this exact system attempt a field repair that could save you hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the expensive car and the unusual sight of a tech CEO in animated conversation with a woman who clearly wasn't from his usual social circle. Several people had their phones out, and Michael was acutely aware that whatever happened next would probably end up on social media within minutes. "Sir," Sarah continued, noting his glance toward the crowd, "I know how this looks. I know what assumptions you're making about me based on my appearance and circumstances. But your car is going to suffer irreversible damage in approximately 25 minutes, and I'm the only person here who understands the technical specifications well enough to prevent it." Michael felt trapped between his natural skepticism, his mounting desperation, and his awareness that this conversation was becoming a public spectacle. The rational part of his mind acknowledged that this woman spoke with genuine technical expertise, but the cautious businessman in him saw too many red flags to ignore. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his tone carrying a note of finality. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to handle this through proper channels." He turned away, pulling up his security company's number on his phone. Within minutes, 2 guards from a nearby corporate campus would arrive to escort this woman away from his vehicle and end this uncomfortable encounter. It was the safe choice, the sensible choice, the choice that protected his assets and his reputation. Sarah watched him make the call with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. She'd seen this decision made countless times over the past 3 years by employers, landlords, social service workers, and well-meaning volunteers. When faced with someone who didn't fit neat categories, most people chose the comfort of dismissal over the uncertainty of engagement. "I understand," she said quietly, taking a step back. "I hope your authorized technicians arrive in time." She turned to leave, her dignity intact despite the rejection, just as the car's internal warning system began to emit a series of increasingly urgent beeps. The beeping intensified as Sarah walked away, each tone a countdown to expensive disaster. Michael stared at his phone screen, watching the manufacturer's service tracker show his technician still 40 minutes out, while his car's diagnostic system flashed increasingly dire warnings. Battery core temperature rising, thermal regulation failing, estimated time to critical failure, 18 minutes. Shit, he muttered, then louder, shit. The security guards he'd called were pulling up in their marked vehicle, but what good were security guards against a quantum battery meltdown? Michael found himself looking back toward Sarah's retreating figure, his businessman's instinct warring with his growing panic. One of the guards approached him, a tall man in his 50s with kind eyes and the steady bearing of someone who'd seen his share of difficult situations. "Mr. Harrison, you called about someone bothering you near your vehicle." "Yes, there was a woman here claiming she could fix my car, but claiming she could fix a Tesla." The guard's eyebrows rose with interest rather than skepticism. "Blonde lady, maybe mid-40s, Michigan sweatshirt." Michael nodded, surprised by the specific recognition. "That's Dr. Whitmore," the guard said, glancing toward where Sarah was now disappearing around a corner. "She teaches my daughter's science classes at the West Side shelter." "Brilliant woman. My kid comes home every week talking about whatever Professor Whitmore explained about chemistry or physics or engineering. She makes everything make sense, you know." The information hit Michael like ice water. The West Side shelter. She really was homeless, not some elaborate corporate spy. And she really did teach science, which meant she really might have the expertise she claimed. "Sir," the second guard added, "if Dr. Whitmore said she could help with your car, she probably meant it. The shelter folks say she used to be some kind of big-shot engineer before she ended up there. Never talks about what happened, but everyone knows she's the real deal." Michael's phone buzzed with a text from the Tesla service center. "Technician delayed due to traffic. ETA now 75 minutes. Advise customer to shut down all systems and evacuate area if thermal warnings persist." 75 minutes. His car's diagnostic system was now showing 12 minutes to critical failure. "Where did she go?" Michael asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Library, probably," the first guard replied. "She walks there every morning, about 6 blocks that way." Michael was already running. He found Sarah in the science section of the Chicago Public Library, seated at a small table with a stack of discarded engineering journals and what appeared to be complex calculations written on the back of old library flyers. She looked up as he approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Dr. Whitmore," he said, slightly out of breath, "I made a mistake." She set down her pencil and folded her hands. "Did your authorized technicians arrive?" "They're still an hour away, and my car is saying I have about 10 minutes before the battery core goes critical." Michael pulled out his phone, showing her the diagnostic screen. "I was wrong to dismiss you. If you're still willing to help, I need your expertise." Sarah studied the diagnostic display, her trained eye parsing the technical readout with practiced speed. "The cascade is accelerating faster than normal, probably due to the ambient humidity interacting with the thermal differential." She looked up at him. "Mr. Harrison, I want to be clear about something. If I do this, if I save your car and prove my capabilities, I need your word that you won't just walk away afterward and forget this happened." "What do you mean?" "I mean I've spent 3 years watching people benefit from my knowledge and then pretend I don't exist. I've taught children, solved problems, provided insights, and been treated like a temporary inconvenience once the crisis passed." Her voice remained steady, but Michael could see the pain behind her professional demeanor. "If I save your car, I want a real conversation about why someone with my qualifications is living in a shelter, and I want your help in changing that situation." Michael felt the weight of her condition, understanding for the first time that this wasn't just about automotive repair. This was about human dignity and systemic failures that he'd never had to consider before. "You have my word," he said, "but we need to move now." Sarah closed the journal she'd been reading and stood up. "Then let's go save your car." The crowd around Michael's Tesla had grown to nearly 30 people, all drawn by the increasingly dramatic light show emanating from the vehicle's warning systems. The car's diagnostic screen now displayed angry red alerts in multiple languages, and the smell of overheated electronics filled the cold air. Sarah approached the scene with Michael beside her, her step quickening as she assessed the visible symptoms of the failing system. "I need your emergency toolkit," she said, already moving toward the car's trunk, and will need to access the secondary cooling manifold through the rear service panel. Michael fumbled with the electronic trunk release, his hands shaking slightly with adrenaline. The toolkit is in the carbon fiber case, but Dr. Whitmore, you should know that if this goes wrong, it won't go wrong, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who understood the technology at a molecular level. But I need you to trust my instructions completely. No questioning, no second guessing. Can you do that? Michael nodded, watching as she opened his emergency toolkit with the practiced efficiency of someone who had worked with these exact tools before. Her hands moved with surgeon-like precision, selecting specific implements while her eyes stayed focused on the car's rear panel. The crowd needs to move back at least 50 feet, she said without looking up. If the thermal runaway reaches the main battery cells, we'll have a brief but spectacular lithium fire. The security guards immediately began moving people away from the vehicle, their authority lending weight to Sarah's warning. Michael found himself caught between admiration for her calm competence and terror at her matter-of-fact mention of fire. What exactly are you going to do? He asked, positioning himself where she could hand him tools as needed. The secondary cooling loop uses a specialized fluid that expands under extreme heat, Sarah explained while carefully removing the rear service panel. When the expansion exceeds the system's capacity, it creates a pressure lock that prevents normal circulation. The authorized repair procedure calls for complete system drainage and refill, which takes hours and requires specialized equipment. She pointed to a specific component deep within the car's mechanical systems. But if you understand the physics involved, you can create a controlled pressure release that allows the system to self-regulate. It's not a permanent fix, but it will prevent the thermal cascade and let you drive safely until proper service can be scheduled. Michael watched as she reached into the mechanical maze with tools that seemed impossibly small for the task. Her movements were deliberate and confident, each action clearly part of a larger plan that existed fully formed in her mind. The tricky part, she continued, her voice slightly strained with concentration, is timing the pressure release to coincide with the thermal expansion cycle. Too early and you just delay the inevitable. Too late and the system locks up permanently. The car's warning beeps had accelerated to an almost continuous tone, and the diagnostic screen showed 4 minutes to critical failure. Several people in the watching crowd were recording the scene on their phones, though they maintained the safe distance the security guards had established. There, Sarah said, making a subtle adjustment with what looked like a modified hex wrench. I can hear the pressure differential changing. The circulation should restore itself in about 30 seconds. Michael held his breath, watching the diagnostic screen with the intensity of someone whose entire morning depended on the expertise of a woman he dismissed as a potential threat just 20 minutes earlier. The warning tones continued their urgent rhythm, but Sarah seemed completely calm, her ear cocked toward the car's mechanical systems as if listening to a familiar song. Now, she said quietly, making one final adjustment. The warning tone suddenly stopped. The diagnostic screen flickered, ran through a series of system checks, then displayed a message Michael had never been more happy to see: thermal management system stabilized. Performance limited to 75% capacity, service recommended within 48 hours. A spontaneous cheer went up from the watching crowd, several of whom had been recording the entire repair process. Sarah carefully replaced the service panel and began returning tools to Michael's emergency kit, her expression professionally satisfied but not surprised. It'll run fine until you can get to a proper service center, she said, wiping her hands on a shop rag. Just don't push it too hard until then. Michael stared at the now calm diagnostic display, then at Sarah, then back at the car. That was incredible. How did you know exactly which adjustments to make? Because I helped write the original specifications for this system, Sarah replied simply. I know its weaknesses and its tolerances better than the people who manufactured it. The crowd was beginning to disperse, though several people approached to thank Sarah and ask questions about the repair. Michael watched her interact with genuine warmth and patience, explaining technical concepts in ways that made sense to curious observers. This was clearly someone who had spent years teaching and was comfortable being the center of positive attention. One of the security guards approached them. Dr. Whitmore, that was something else.
My daughter is going to flip when I tell her about this. Sarah smiled, the first completely genuine expression Michael had seen from her. Tell Emma I said hello, and remind her that Thursday is our session on electromagnetic principles. As the crowd finally dispersed and the security guards returned to their patrol, Michael found himself alone with Sarah beside his now functional car. The morning's crisis had passed, but he was beginning to understand that their interaction was just beginning. You kept your word about the repair, he said. Now I need to keep mine about that conversation. There's a coffee shop 6 blocks from here, Michael said, checking his watch. We can talk privately, and I can call my assistant to reschedule this morning's meeting. Sarah hesitated, clearly weighing the offer. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate the gesture, but I look like someone who's been living in a shelter for 8 months. Most establishments make it clear that people like me aren't welcome. Michael felt a flush of embarrassment as he realized the obvious problem he'd overlooked. His world of tech meetings and investor presentations existed in spaces that systematically excluded people like Sarah, regardless of their qualifications or circumstances. Then we'll make sure you're welcome, he said firmly. But first there's something I want you to see. He led her to the nearest high-end shopping district, a collection of boutiques and professional services that catered to Chicago's business elite. Sarah followed with obvious reluctance, her discomfort growing as they passed storefronts that clearly targeted customers with disposable income she didn't possess. Mr. Harrison, I don't think this is a good idea, she said, as they stopped in front of an upscale clothing store. I can't afford anything here, and I don't want to waste anyone's time. You're not wasting time, you're allowing me to correct a mistake, Michael replied. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. Consider it part of your consulting fee for saving my car. The store's staff initially reacted to Sarah with barely concealed skepticism, but their attitudes shifted dramatically when Michael introduced her as his engineering consultant and made it clear that cost was not a consideration. Within an hour, Sarah emerged from the fitting room transformed, not in her essential character, but in the external markers that society used to judge worth and credibility. The tailored blazer and professional slacks didn't change who she was, but they changed how others saw her. Michael watched the subtle shift in the store employees' body language, the way they suddenly made eye contact and offered genuine smiles instead of polite wariness. How do you feel? He asked as they left the store. Like I'm wearing a costume, Sarah replied honestly. These clothes cost more than most people at the shelter see in 6 months. It feels wrong somehow.
What feels wrong is that society judges your expertise based on your wardrobe, Michael said. But if changing clothes gets people to listen to your ideas, then we're playing by their rules until we can change the game. They found a quiet restaurant where Michael was clearly a regular customer. The hostess seated them immediately at a private table, and Michael ordered coffee and pastries while Sarah acclimated to being in a space where she was treated as a welcome customer rather than a potential problem. Tell me about the General Motors incident, Michael said once they were settled. I want to understand what really happened. Sarah stared into her coffee cup for a long moment, gathering thoughts she rarely shared with anyone. I was lead engineer on a propulsion system prototype for a military contract. The project was behind schedule and over budget, so management decided to accelerate testing by skipping several safety protocols I designed into the process. Her voice grew quieter as she continued. I submitted 3 separate reports explaining why those protocols were essential. I showed them the failure analysis, the risk assessments, the potential consequences. But the marketing department had already promised delivery dates to the client, and my safety concerns were seen as obstacles to profitability. Michael leaned forward, recognizing the familiar tension between engineering caution and business pressure. What happened when they overrode your recommendations? Exactly what I predicted. The prototype failed during its demonstration flight, crashed into a test facility, injured 3 technicians, and caused $40 million in damage. Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Within 24 hours, the company announced that the failure was due to flawed engineering leadership and poor safety oversight. My name was prominently mentioned in their press release. But the investigation proved you were right. 6 months later, after I'd been fired, blacklisted, and had burned through my savings trying to find new employment. Sarah's voice carried the weight of old frustration. The vindication meant nothing by then. The advanced propulsion industry is small and gossip travels fast. I was radioactive, the engineer whose project killed people and cost millions regardless of the actual facts. Michael shook his head, understanding now why someone with Sarah's credentials had fallen through society's cracks. You couldn't get interviews anywhere. Oh, I got interviews, Sarah said with bitter humor. Lots of them. But they were going through the motions, checking boxes to show they'd considered a diverse candidate. The decision was always made before I walked into the room. You can see it in their eyes, they're already crafting the polite rejection email while asking about my experience. She looked directly at Michael, add in the fact that I'm a Hispanic woman in a field dominated by white men and the whispered rumors about being difficult to work with and not a team player, and you have a perfect storm of systematic exclusion. I was overqualified for junior positions and too risky for senior ones. Michael felt a growing sense of shame as he recognized his own initial reaction to Sarah. He'd made the same snap judgments, the same assumptions based on appearance rather than ability. The only difference was that circumstances had forced him to look beyond his prejudices. How did you end up homeless? He asked gently. Gradually, then suddenly, Sarah replied. Savings ran out while I was still trying to find work. Lost my apartment, moved in with friends until I wore out their hospitality. Tried sleeping in my car until it broke down and I couldn't afford repairs. Applied for government assistance but fell into bureaucratic gaps, too educated for some programs, too broke for others. She paused, staring out the restaurant window at people passing by in the normal rhythm of their lives. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort. It was becoming invisible. People look right through you when you're homeless, like you're not quite human anymore. Your opinions don't matter, your expertise is suspect, your existence is an inconvenience to be managed rather than a problem to be solved. Michael realized he was seeing not just Sarah's personal tragedy, but a glimpse into systematic failures he'd never had reason to consider. Yet you kept studying, kept working on problems. What else could I do? Stop being an engineer because society decided I was disposable. Sarah's voice carried quiet defiance. I volunteer at the shelter because those kids deserve to understand how the world works regardless of their circumstances. I read technical journals because my mind needs challenges to stay sharp. I work on solutions to problems because that's who I am, not because anyone is paying me to do it. She reached into her bag and pulled out several folded papers covered with equations and diagrams. I've solved optimization problems for quantum computing systems that your industry won't even identify for another 5 years. I've designed cooling solutions that would revolutionize data center efficiency. I've created material specifications that could transform advanced propulsion manufacturing. Michael examined the papers with growing amazement. The mathematics were beyond his expertise, but he could recognize elegant solutions when he saw them. This is incredible work. These concepts could be worth millions. They could be, Sarah agreed. But they're worthless as long as I'm the invisible woman proposing them. Which brings us back to your earlier promise. You said you wanted to change my situation. I'm curious what you had in mind. Michael folded the papers carefully and handed them back to her. An idea was forming in his mind, one that could transform both their futures while addressing the systematic problems that had brought them together. I want you to meet my investors, he said. Michael's investor meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the penthouse conference room of Millennium Tower, with a view of Lake Michigan that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. By 1:45, of Chicago's most influential venture capitalists were settling into leather chairs around a polished table, scrolling through tablets loaded with Nexus Dynamics' latest projections and technical specifications. Sarah stood in the executive washroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror and fighting a wave of imposter syndrome that threatened to overwhelm her carefully constructed composure. The business attire Michael had bought her that morning fit perfectly, but she felt like she was wearing a costume for a role she wasn't sure she could play. Dr. Whitmore. Michael appeared in the doorway, his expression mixing encouragement with nervous energy. They're ready for us, Mr. Harrison, Sarah said, turning to face him. I want you to know that whatever happens in there, I appreciate the opportunity. It's been 3 years since anyone asked for my professional opinion on anything more complex than which laundry detergent works best in cold water. Michael straightened his tie, a gesture Sarah recognized as his own nervous tell. These are smart people, but they're also cautious. They invest in proven technologies and established teams. What we're about to show them challenges both those assumptions. You mean what you're about to show them, Sarah corrected. I'm here as your consulting engineer, remember. This is your company, your presentation, your risk. No, Michael said firmly. This is our presentation. I'm going to introduce you as my new partner and chief technology officer, and then you're going to blow their minds with solutions to problems they didn't even know they had. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Partner. Michael, we met 6 hours ago when you thought I was a potential car thief. You can't just I can and I am. Michael interrupted. Dr. Whitmore, in the past 6 hours you've demonstrated more technical brilliance than most of my engineers show in 6 months. You solved a problem that stumped Tesla's own technicians using improvised tools and street-level ingenuity. More than that, you've shown me blind spots in my own thinking that I never knew existed. He paused, checking his watch. Those investors in there are looking for the next breakthrough in quantum computing thermal management. You have solutions sketched on library flyers that are years ahead of anything we've developed. The question isn't whether you're qualified to be my partner, it's whether I'm qualified to be yours. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settling around her like a familiar equation finally balancing. All right, Mr. Harrison, let's show them what systematic exclusion has cost them. They entered the conference room together, and Sarah immediately felt the subtle shift in energy that occurred whenever she walked into a space dominated by wealthy white men. The polite attention, the careful assessment, the slight tension that came from people trying to place her in their mental categories. Gentlemen, Michael began, his voice carrying the confident authority that had built his reputation in venture capital circles. Thank you for your patience with this morning's delays. I want to introduce Dr. Sarah Whitmore, who just became Nexus Dynamics Chief Technology Officer, and my partner in what I believe will be the most significant breakthrough in quantum computing infrastructure in the next decade. 12 pairs of eyes focused on Sarah with renewed interest, though she could see the questions forming behind their professional expressions. Chief Technology Officer. Partner, where had this woman come from, and why was Michael Harrison staking his reputation on someone none of them had heard of? Dr. Whitmore was formerly Senior Research Director at General Motors' Advanced Propulsion Division, Michael continued, and she holds patents in thermal dynamics that form the foundation of current advanced propulsion and automotive cooling systems. This morning, she prevented a catastrophic failure in my Tesla using field-improvised techniques that Tesla's own engineers said were impossible. One of the investors, a silver-haired man Sarah recognized from Forbes articles about clean energy funding, leaned forward with interest. Dr. Whitmore, that's quite an impressive introduction. Could you tell us about your recent work? Sarah stood and moved to the presentation screen, her initial nervousness transforming into the focused energy she'd always felt when discussing technical challenges. Quantum computing faces a fundamental thermal management problem that current solutions address inefficiently. Existing cooling systems work against the quantum effects we're trying to harness, rather than working with them. She pulled out one of her hand-drawn diagrams and projected it onto the screen. What you're looking at is a cooling architecture that uses quantum coherence itself as a thermal regulation mechanism. Instead of fighting the quantum effects, we use them to create a self-regulating system that actually becomes more efficient as processing demands increase. The room fell silent as 12 of Chicago's sharpest minds processed what they were seeing. Sarah continued, her confidence building as she entered her element. Current quantum computers operate at near absolute zero because thermal interference destroys quantum coherence. But what if we could design a system where thermal energy enhanced coherence instead of destroying it? She moved to a whiteboard and began sketching additional diagrams. The mathematics are complex, but the principle is elegant. We're essentially turning thermal dynamics into a quantum computing resource instead of treating it as a problem to be overcome. The silver-haired investor raised his hand. Dr. Whitmore, are you suggesting that quantum computers could operate at room temperature? Not just room temperature, Sarah replied, her eyes bright with the excitement of sharing breakthrough concepts with people who could understand their implications. I'm suggesting they could operate more efficiently at higher temperatures, using ambient thermal energy as part of their computational matrix. The implications hit the room like lightning. Room temperature quantum computing would eliminate the massive cooling infrastructure that made current systems prohibitively expensive for most applications. It would democratize quantum computing in the same way personal computers had democratized information processing in the 1980s. Another investor spoke up, his voice tight with barely controlled excitement.
What kind of efficiency improvements are we talking about? Sarah turned back to the whiteboard, covering it with equations that flowed from her mind with practiced ease. Conservative estimates suggest a 300% improvement in computational efficiency with a 90% reduction in operational costs. Optimistic projections go much higher. The room erupted in questions, technical challenges, requests for more detailed specifications. For the next hour, Sarah fielded every inquiry with the depth of knowledge that came from years of focused research and practical experience. She addressed manufacturing concerns, scalability questions, patent landscapes, and competitive advantages with the authority of someone who had considered every angle. Michael watched with growing amazement as Sarah commanded the room with effortless expertise. These were investors who prided themselves on finding flaws in even the most promising protestations, but they were leaning forward like students eager to learn from a master teacher. Dr. Whitmore, the silver-haired investor, said finally, "This is remarkable work. But I have to ask, where has this research been? Why haven't we seen publications, conference presentations, patent filings?" Sarah's expression grew serious, and Michael felt the room's energy shift as everyone sensed they were approaching sensitive territory. "That's an important question," Sarah said, her voice steady but carrying emotional weight. "For the past 3 years I've been conducting this research while living in the West Side homeless shelter, using discarded materials and borrowed library computers. My previous employer destroyed my career over a safety dispute, and the systematic bias in our industry has prevented me from accessing traditional research resources or academic positions." The silence in the room was profound. 12 successful investors stared at a woman who had just presented world-changing technology while living in circumstances they associated with personal failure rather than systematic injustice. "The breakthrough concepts you've seen today were developed on the backs of library flyers and restaurant napkins," Sarah continued, "because that's what I had available. Imagine what might have been accomplished if I'd had access to proper resources, research teams, and institutional support." The silver-haired investor was the first to speak. "Dr. Whitmore, I think I speak for everyone here when I say we're impressed by your technical brilliance, but we're also deeply troubled by what your story reveals about our industry's failures." He looked around the table at his colleagues, who were nodding in agreement. How many others like Dr. Whitmore are out there? How many breakthrough innovations have we lost because we judge talent by zip codes and wardrobe choices instead of actual capability? Another investor, a woman who had built her reputation funding underrepresented entrepreneurs, spoke up with evident emotion. "This is exactly what we talk about when we discuss systemic bias. Here's a woman with world-changing ideas, living in a shelter because our industry's networking structures excluded her after one corporate injustice. The question now," said a third investor, "is what we do about it. Dr. Whitmore, Mr. Harrison, what are you proposing in terms of structure and funding?" Michael stepped forward, clearly ready for this moment. "We're proposing a 2-phase approach. Phase 1 is immediate investment in Dr. Whitmore's quantum cooling technology, with her as Chief Technology Officer and equal partner in a new subsidiary focused on breakthrough thermal management systems. Phase 2, Sarah continued seamlessly, is the establishment of the Invisible Talent Initiative, a research and development incubator specifically designed to identify and support brilliant individuals who have been systematically excluded from traditional innovation channels." The room buzzed with interest as the investors processed the implications. This wasn't just a technology investment, it was a social impact initiative with the potential for extraordinary returns on multiple levels. "We're talking about creating a new model for talent identification," Michael explained. "Instead of recruiting from the same elite universities and corporate pipelines, we actively seek out overlooked genius wherever it exists. Homeless shelters, community colleges, failed startups, people who fell through cracks due to discrimination or circumstance." Sarah moved to the whiteboard again, this time sketching organizational charts instead of technical diagrams. The traditional venture capital model assumes that the best talent rises naturally to the top of existing hierarchies. But what if those hierarchies are fundamentally flawed? What if they're systematically filtering out exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need to solve tomorrow's problems? The silver-haired investor leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. It's an intriguing concept, but how do you identify genuine talent versus people who simply tell compelling stories about their circumstances? The same way you identify it anywhere else, Sarah replied without hesitation. Through demonstrated problem-solving ability, technical knowledge and practical results. The difference is that instead of looking for those qualities in corporate boardrooms and academic conferences, you look for them in community centers, public libraries and adult education programs. We've already identified our first test case, Michael added with a slight smile. This morning, Dr. Whitmore diagnosed and repaired a quantum battery system failure that Tesla's own engineers said was impossible to fix in the field. She did it using improvised tools and encyclopedic knowledge of thermodynamics. That's the kind of practical brilliance traditional recruiting methods miss completely. One of the younger investors raised a concern that had clearly been bothering him. But Dr. Whitmore, you mentioned patents and publications from your MIT days. Surely your academic credentials should have opened doors regardless of recent circumstances. Sarah's expression grew somber. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But homelessness is its own form of professional death. When you have no permanent address, no reliable phone, no professional wardrobe, no transportation, your MIT credentials become irrelevant. HR departments don't even schedule interviews with people who list shelter addresses on applications. She paused, gathering her thoughts. More fundamentally, our industry has unconscious bias baked into every level of the hiring process. Technical interviews that assume familiarity with expensive software rather than underlying principles. Networking events and venues and at times that exclude people working multiple jobs or lacking transportation. Reference checks that penalize people whose former colleagues are afraid of guilt by association. The woman investor nodded vigorously. I see this constantly. We talk about meritocracy, but we've created systems that only recognize merit when it comes packaged in familiar forms. So the Invisible Talent Initiative would systematically identify and remove those barriers, Michael explained. Provide resources, mentorship and most importantly, platforms where people can demonstrate capabilities rather than credentials. What kind of return on investment are we looking at? Another investor asked, bringing the conversation back to practical considerations. Sarah and Michael exchanged a look, clearly having anticipated this question. Conservatively, Sarah began, the quantum cooling technology alone represents a potential market disruption worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Room temperature quantum computing would transform every industry from drug discovery to financial modeling to climate simulation. But the real ROI comes from the talent pipeline, Michael added. If we're right about systematic exclusion of innovative thinking, then the Invisible Talent Initiative should produce breakthrough technologies at a rate that makes traditional R&D look glacially slow and prohibitively expensive. The silver-haired investor was making notes on his tablet, clearly running calculations. Dr. Whitmore, I need to ask directly, why should we believe you can manage this kind of large-scale operation? Technical brilliance and organizational leadership are different skill sets. Sarah smiled, the question clearly not catching her off guard. You're absolutely right to ask. But consider this, for 3 years I've been managing complex logistics with essentially no resources. I've maintained physical and mental health while navigating bureaucratic systems designed to exhaust and discourage people. I've continued advancing my technical knowledge while teaching children, volunteering at community programs, and dealing with the constant stress of uncertain housing and food security. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I've built trust and respect in communities that have every reason to be suspicious of outsiders. I've solved complex problems under pressure while maintaining dignity in circumstances that would break many people. If I can do all that while living in a shelter, imagine what I can accomplish with proper resources and institutional support. The room fell quiet again as the investors processed not just Sarah's technical capabilities, but her demonstration of leadership under impossible circumstances. There's something else, Michael said, breaking the silence. Dr. Whitmore has agreed to this partnership on one condition. Any success we achieve, any profits we generate, any recognition we receive, she wants 50% of it reinvested directly into expanding opportunities for other overlooked talent. This isn't about personal enrichment, it's about systematic change. The woman investor smiled broadly. Now that sounds like someone I want to do business with. 3 hours later, as the last investor left the conference room after committing to the largest seed funding round in Nexus Dynamics history, Michael and Sarah stood together by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the water, and the city below buzzed with the ordinary energy of people heading home from ordinary jobs to ordinary lives. $12 million in initial funding, Michael said, still somewhat stunned by the morning's transformation. Full partnership agreement, complete creative control over the technical development, and unanimous enthusiasm for the Invisible Talent Initiative. Sarah nodded, but her expression was contemplative rather than celebratory. Michael, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about quantum computing, or even about creating opportunities for excluded talent. This is about fundamentally changing how society defines and recognizes value. She turned from the window to face him directly. 6 hours ago, I was invisible. My knowledge, my experience, my 3 years of breakthrough research, none of it mattered because I didn't have an address and wore second-hand clothes. But I haven't actually changed. I'm the same person with the same capabilities I was when you first saw me standing next to your car. Michael felt the weight of her words, understanding that she was pushing him to grapple with uncomfortable truths about the systems he'd navigated successfully his entire life. The only thing that changed, Sarah continued, was your willingness to see me. And that only happened because you were desperate enough to look past your initial assumptions. How many other people are out there right now, equally brilliant, equally capable, but invisible, because the right crisis hasn't forced anyone to notice them? She moved to the whiteboard where remnants of her technical diagrams were still visible. The Invisible Talent Initiative can't just be about finding individual success stories. It has to be about examining and changing the fundamental assumptions that create invisibility in the first place. Michael joined her at the whiteboard, studying the complex equations that represented breakthrough thinking developed under conditions most people couldn't imagine surviving. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we use our success to ask uncomfortable questions, Sarah said. Why does society equate homelessness with personal failure, rather than systematic breakdown? Why do we assume that people with unconventional backgrounds lack competence? Why do we design opportunities in ways that systematically exclude the most innovative thinkers? She picked up a marker and began sketching a new kind of diagram, not technical specifications, but organizational structures that looked unlike anything Michael had seen before. Traditional research institutions recruit talent through predictable pipelines, and then wonder why they keep getting predictable results, she explained while drawing. Elite universities feeding into elite corporations, creating an echo chamber of similar backgrounds, similar training, similar ways of thinking about problems. But breakthrough innovation almost always comes from the edges, from people who approach problems from unexpected angles because they've lived unexpected lives. She connected various elements of her diagram with bold lines. The Invisible Talent Initiative needs to be more than just alternative recruiting. It needs to be alternative thinking about the entire innovation process. Michael studied her organizational chart, recognizing something revolutionary in its structure. You're talking about institutionalizing outsider perspective. Exactly, Sarah said, her excitement growing as she elaborated on the concept. What if we created research environments specifically designed to support non-traditional thinkers? Not trying to force unconventional people into conventional structures, but building new structures that amplify their strengths, instead of penalizing their differences. She began filling in details on the diagram: flexible schedules for people managing complex life circumstances, remote work options for people without reliable transportation, project-based compensation for people who can't commit to traditional employment, most importantly, evaluation criteria based on problem-solving results, rather than process conformity. Michael felt his understanding of the project's scope expanding dramatically. This isn't just about quantum computing research, this is about creating a parallel innovation ecosystem. One that captures and develops talent that traditional systems lose or exclude, Sarah agreed. And because we're drawing from a completely different talent pool, we should generate breakthrough solutions to problems that conventional research hasn't been able to solve.
She paused, considering her next words carefully. Michael, I want to be clear about what we're really doing here. This initiative isn't charity or social work disguised as business strategy. I genuinely believe that systematic exclusion of innovative thinking represents the single greatest waste of human potential in modern society. Companies and institutions are literally throwing away their competitive advantages by filtering out people who think differently. Michael nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the full implications of their partnership. You're suggesting that businesses have a self-interest in disrupting their own bias. I'm suggesting that bias is bad business, Sarah replied firmly. It's costly, inefficient, and it systematically eliminates exactly the kind of creative problem-solving that drives innovation. The Invisible Talent Initiative should be profitable precisely because it's accessing intellectual resources that others are wasting. She returned to the window, gazing out at the city with new eyes. Every homeless shelter, every community college, every unemployment office contains people with extraordinary capabilities that our economy isn't smart enough to utilize. We're going to change that, one brilliant individual at a time. Michael joined her at the window, following her gaze across Chicago's sprawling neighborhoods. Somewhere out there were others like Dr. Whitmore, other world-changing minds living invisible lives because society had stopped looking for genius in unexpected places. Where do we start? He asked. Sarah smiled, pulling out her phone to check the time. We start by keeping our promises. I need to get back to the shelter for tonight's science class. I have 8 kids waiting to learn about electromagnetic fields, and they don't care about quantum computing breakthroughs or venture capital funding. They just want to understand why compass needles point north. She gathered her papers, including the hand-drawn diagrams that had helped transform both their lives in a single afternoon. But tomorrow we start building something that ensures kids like them never have to choose between intellectual curiosity and economic survival. As they prepared to leave the conference room where everything had changed, Michael realized that saving his car had been the least important thing Sarah had accomplished that day. She'd saved his perspective, challenged his assumptions, and opened his eyes to possibilities he'd never considered. Dr. Whitmore, he said, as they waited for the elevator, thank you for not giving up on me when I gave up on you. Michael, she replied, using his first name for the first time, I never gave up on you. I gave up on systems that told us we were too different to work together. There's a distinction worth remembering. 6 months later, the Invisible Talent Initiative's opening ceremony took place not in a gleaming corporate headquarters, but in a renovated community center on Chicago's South Side. The location was deliberate, a statement about bringing opportunity to people rather than expecting people to come to opportunity. Sarah stood before a crowd of reporters, investors, city officials, and most importantly, dozens of individuals whose talents had been discovered and nurtured through the initiative's pilot programs. The diversity of the group would have been impossible to achieve through traditional recruiting channels. Former homeless individuals, people with criminal records who had found redemption through technical education, immigrants whose foreign credentials weren't recognized by U.S. employers, and working parents who had been excluded from opportunities requiring extensive travel or inflexible schedules. 6 months ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium. I was living in a homeless shelter and conducting quantum computing research on discarded library materials. Today our team has filed 17 patents, launched 3 breakthrough products, and most importantly, demonstrated that systematic exclusion of unconventional talent represents one of the greatest business inefficiencies in modern history. Applause filled the room, but Sarah continued before it could fully subside. The success stories you'll hear about today aren't exceptional achievements by extraordinary individuals. They're normal results from normal people who were given access to opportunities that should have been available all along. She gestured to a woman in the front row, a formerly homeless veteran who had developed revolutionary battery storage technology. Jessica Martinez spent 2 years living in her car while developing energy solutions that are now being implemented by 3 major utilities. Her innovations emerged not despite her circumstances, but because her circumstances gave her insights into energy efficiency that traditional researchers missed. Next she indicated a man whose immigrant status had prevented him from working in his field of expertise. Dr. Ahmed Hassan couldn't get his Syrian engineering credentials recognized in the United States, so he drove taxi while solving computational problems in his spare time. His algorithms now form the foundation of our most successful quantum cooling implementation. The examples continued. each one representing not just individual success but systematic failure on the part of institutions that had overlooked obvious talent. The audience listened with growing understanding that they weren't just witnessing a social program but a demonstration of wasted economic potential being reclaimed. Michael took the podium next, his presentation focused on the business case for inclusive talent development. Traditional venture capital assumes that the best ideas emerge from predictable sources, elite universities, established corporations, well-connected entrepreneurial networks. But our experience suggests the opposite may be true. He clicked to a slide showing comparative innovation metrics. In 6 months, the Invisible Talent Initiative has generated breakthrough solutions at a rate 3 times faster than our traditional R&D pipeline, with development costs 60% lower than industry standards. This isn't because we're doing charity work, it's because we're accessing intellectual resources that others are systematically ignoring. The data was compelling, but the real proof was in the room itself. Patents filed by people without college degrees, technical solutions developed by individuals who had been written off by society, business proposals from entrepreneurs who had been deemed too risky for conventional funding. The most important thing to understand, Michael continued, is that this isn't a temporary social experiment. Inclusive talent development represents a sustainable competitive advantage. While other organizations compete for the same pool of conventional candidates, we're accessing an entirely different universe of intellectual resources. After the formal presentations, Sarah moved through the crowd, greeting individuals whose lives had intersected with the initiative in various ways. She stopped to talk with Emma, the security guard's daughter who now attended weekly advanced science classes. She congratulated Marcus, a formerly incarcerated individual whose insights into urban logistics had revolutionized delivery systems for 3 major retailers. But the conversation that moved her most was with Dr. Eleanor Ellison, her former colleague from Space Tech, who had flown in from California specifically for the opening ceremony. Sarah, Dr. Ellison said, embracing her warmly, "I owe you an apology that's 3 years overdue. I should have fought harder to keep you in the industry when everything fell apart." Sarah smiled, recognizing the guilt she'd seen in the eyes of many former colleagues who had watched her professional destruction without intervening. "Eleanor, you did what you could within the constraints of a flawed system, but that system is changing, one opportunity at a time. I want to be part of that change," Dr. Ellison said firmly. "Space Tech is interested in forming a partnership with the initiative. We have problems that conventional thinking hasn't been able to solve, and we're ready to try unconventional approaches." As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing again with Michael in a space where their partnership had transformed multiple lives. The community center was quiet now, but it hummed with the energy of possibility, breakthrough technologies being developed, lives being rebuilt, systematic barriers being dismantled one person at a time. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked, noting her contemplative expression. "I'm thinking about the kids I taught at the shelter," Sarah replied. "Some of them are in high school now, taking advanced science classes and talking about college. They don't know yet that society might try to convince them their backgrounds disqualify them from intellectual achievement. My job is to make sure that by the time they find out, it won't matter anymore." She looked around the community center, envisioning the expansion plans that would bring similar facilities to cities across the country. This is just the beginning. Every major metropolitan area has its own population of invisible genius, waiting for someone to recognize their potential. Michael nodded, understanding now that their partnership had evolved beyond business collaboration into something resembling social transformation. "Sarah, I have a confession. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that the homeless woman by my broken car would become my most important business partner and closest collaborator, I would have thought they were insane." "That confession doesn't surprise me," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "What does surprise me is that you were willing to acknowledge your initial judgment and change your perspective. Most people defend their first impressions rather than questioning them." "I had help," Michael admitted. "You made it pretty hard to ignore your qualifications once I stopped focusing on your circumstances." Sarah turned to face him directly, her expression serious. "Michael, I need you to remember something as we move forward. I didn't become brilliant when you decided to notice me. I didn't become capable when investors decided to fund me.
I didn't become valuable when society decided to recognize my worth. She paused, ensuring he understood the importance of her next words. I was always all those things. The only thing that changed was the willingness of people in power to see past their preconceptions. That distinction matters, because there are thousands of other people out there right now who are equally brilliant, equally capable, equally valuable, and equally invisible. Michael felt the weight of responsibility settling around him like a familiar burden. So our job is to make sure they don't stay invisible. Our job, Sarah corrected gently, is to change the systems that make people invisible in the first place. Individual rescue stories are inspiring, but systematic change is what creates lasting impact. As they prepared to leave the community center, Sarah paused at the door to look back at the space where so many lives had been touched by opportunity. Tomorrow classes would resume, research projects would continue, and breakthrough innovations would emerge from minds that traditional systems had written off. You know what the most remarkable thing is, she said to Michael as they stepped into the Chicago evening. None of this required new technology or revolutionary business models. It just required recognizing that talent exists everywhere, and creating structures that allow it to flourish regardless of packaging. The streetlights illuminated their path as they walked toward their respective homes, Michael to his penthouse apartment, Sarah to her own place now, a modest but comfortable home that represented stability rather than status. The distance between their destinations was measured in more than miles, but their partnership had proved that social geography didn't have to determine intellectual collaboration. Same time next week for the quarterly review, Michael asked as they reached the intersection where their paths diverged. Wouldn't miss it. Sarah replied, we have 3 new research proposals to evaluate, and if they're anything like the last batch, we're going to change some more lives. As Michael watched her walk away, he reflected on how profoundly his understanding of talent, worth and opportunity had evolved since that morning when he'd almost dismissed the most important collaboration of his professional life. The woman disappearing into the Chicago night was the same person who had approached his broken car 6 months earlier, but now he possessed the eyes to see what had been there all along. Somewhere in the city around them, other brilliant minds were working on breakthrough solutions to problems the world didn't yet know it had. Some of them were in homeless shelters, some in community colleges, some in minimum wage jobs that barely utilized a fraction of their capabilities. The Invisible Talent Initiative couldn't save them all, but it could prove that systematic exclusion was a choice, not an inevitability, and tomorrow that choice would be made differently, one overlooked genius at a time.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.